समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
Peace hasn't fully broken out between India and China. Troops are still on the ground, although disengaged. However, lots of peacemaking moves have been on, and there's been a flurry of them lately. We've just seen the visit by the Chinese special representative for bilateral talks. This was a mechanism that Vajpayee and Wen Jiabao, his counterpart, Chinese counterpart, set up in 2003. And this has gone on since then. Both countries said that each will nominate one functionary at a very high level to coordinate, to speak or to negotiate with the counterpart on the other side. So to begin with, on the Indian side, it was Brajesh Mishra, the NSA. On the Chinese side, it was Dai Bingguo. Today, by now, the level of the two representatives or special representatives or SRs has been raised. They are both cabinet rank at very high level. On the Indian side, it's NSA Ajit Doval, who is in cabinet rank. And also on the Chinese side, it's Wang Yi, who's not just the foreign minister, but he's a ranking leader in the Communist Party hierarchy. He's also a Politburo member of the Chinese Communist Party. So really a powerful figure in the Chinese government. He had come in for the 24th round of special representative level meetings. The first took place in 2003 and then they carried on. The 22nd took place in 2019. The 23rd then took place in December 2024, and you can see why. The last one was in 2019, and just after that in 2020 we had tension across the line of actual control. There were skirmishes, unarmed skirmishes even in Sikkim at that point, but mostly located in eastern Ladakh region, which finally culminated in the loss of life in Galwan, again without any use of firearms, and then a situation in Kailash range, which you will generally locate somewhere on the southern side of Pangong Tso on the northern side and towards Chushul on the southern side. That is a tankable terrain. That's where Indian Army had taken its heavy stuff, tanks, armored personnel carriers, as did the Chinese, and the tanks on the two sides were standing almost barrel to barrel. That's when the two sides started getting into a slow process of de-escalation. So first, the heavy stuff was disengaged, then a very painstaking and painful, I must say, disengagement process went on for more than 3 years. Now the troops are disengaged, areas for patrolling are demarcated. In fact, there isn't even that much patrolling being carried out. So the troops don't come into conflict with each other. However, one thing that was waiting all of this while was de-escalation. Disengagement is when troops are here, you separate them and they don't come in each other's way. De-escalation is when you ask the heavy stuff, your heavy units, your tanks, artillery, armored personnel carriers, all that stuff, basic hardware of large-scale fighting, industrial-scale fighting, when you take them back to the barracks, when you take them back to their home bases, or at least take them away from their operational deployment areas, that is de-escalation. That had not happened so far. This statement now issued by the MEA, and I will read from that. It's a detailed statement, now talks about de-escalation, that the two sides will now talk, the teams will now talk, and basically they'll be discussing modalities of de-escalation. That's an important thing. There's a couple of other important elements. Now, this is something that we've spoken about in the past. The entire process of normalization between India and China, which started in 1993. In fact, you might say it started with 1988 with Rajiv Gandhi's visit to China, his meeting with Deng Xiaoping, after which the crisis in Sundarum-Shu was not resolved, but at least a kind of calm came in there because the crisis had only emerged in 1986. It still took many more years after that for a disengagement and de-escalation to take place in Sundarum-Chu in the eastern sector, in the Arunachal Pradesh sector. 1993 was one agreement that was under Narasimha Rao, 7th September 1993. And then 29th November 1996, this was under Devagowda's government. Inder Gujral, as foreign minister, has signed that agreement. These set modalities to make sure that any untoward incidents do not happen on the border and that confidence building measures are put in place. Everything that happened subsequently draws from this. Then in 2003, Vajpayee and Benjiabao, they set up the SR mechanism. The SR mechanism then led to the next big round between the new SR from India, because in India the government changed. Vajpayee lost in 2004, UPA came to power. So MK Narayanan now was the interlocutor from the Indian side. Dai Benguo was still there from the Chinese side, and they signed what is called as the 2005 agreement. Now the 2005 agreement is a mouthful in its definition. It is called Agreement between the Government of Republic of India and Government of the People's Republic of China on the political parameters and guiding principles for the settlement of the India-China boundary question. Now what had happened was that for some time now, it looked like China was committed to this agreement, and this agreement has some vital elements. One of those vital elements is something that the Chinese wanted. The Chinese were getting concerned at that point that India was getting very friendly with the US. The situation might look the opposite right now, but with Donald Trump, everything is episodic, so who knows. At that point, that is around time India was headed towards signing the nuclear deal with the US. And that warmth was really growing because the US had lifted all post-Pokhran II sanctions against India. And the US was worried about China. That is when the Chinese had an ask. The Chinese had an ask that they wanted India to declare itself, or India to accept that they will be a cooperative and strategic partner, that India and China will have a cooperative and strategic partnership. That India was reluctant to concede or to accept until the Chinese agreed to two of the Indian demands. And I know from people who negotiated this that this went on almost to the last ball, because the Chinese were holding out, and while the Chinese were holding out, the Indian side was holding out. What were the two demands from the Indian side? These come in Article 6 and Article 7 of this 2005 accord. Article 6 says the boundary should be well-defined and easily identifiable natural geographical features to be mutually agreed upon between the two sides. From the Indian sides, along a lot of this border, India is on the heights. The watershed principle suits India because the mountains, watersheds define borders very often. So India wanted this distinct geographical features element to be added. And the next thing is Article 7, which says, and I'm quoting from it, in reaching a boundary settlement, the two sides shall safeguard due interests of their settled populations in the border areas. Now, when you look at the India-China border mostly is Himalayan wilderness. Very few people live on the border in most areas, but there are areas where you have buzzing localities or buzzing, now in fact a buzzing city very close to the border, say Tawang for example. So once you accept this principle that you will have due regard to your settled populations, it means you will not destabilize what is already settled. That is something that the Chinese seem to have resiled upon. So 2010, when the same Wen Jiabao came to India, by that time it looks like he had changed his mind on the issue. And India also sort of went back to its larger demand that we don't want a boundary settlement in parts. We want one grand bargain. That expression is not used, grand bargain. I am using that basically to telegraph what is stated in very complex diplomatic language, which also I shall repeat to you because that's also important. The 2005 agreement, I told you there were two asks from the Indian side which the Chinese held back on. There was one ask from the Chinese side that India held back on. So I've told you the two from the Indian side which the Chinese conceded. When the Chinese conceded that at the very last moment, around that time it was looking like talks will break down, nothing will be achieved. With the Chinese, it's very tough to negotiate because the Chinese always come from a position of strength. And the fact is today they are a very strong power. Their ask was something that is stated in the preamble, in the first para of the 2005 agreement. You will see the full agreement on your screen. It says, believing that it serves the fundamental interests of the people of India and China to foster a long-term, constructive and cooperative partnership on the basis of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, the old Panchsheel, mutual respect and sensitivity for each other's concerns and aspirations. So long-term, constructive and cooperative partnership. Then it goes on to say, desirous of qualitatively upgrading the bilateral relationship at all levels and in all areas while addressing differences through peaceful means in a fair, reasonable and mutually acceptable manner. And then it goes on to say that both sides will respect the confidence building measures on the border, etc. That is not something that the Chinese followed from 2020 spring onwards. April 2020, the Chinese began to violate it quite aggressively, and then we know what happened as a result. For about 6 months, we had a great deal of tension in eastern Ladakh across the entire frontier there. Now, I told you that I use the expression grand bargain as telegraphies. When you send telegrams in old days, you tried to use as few words as possible because you paid per word. So I used telegraphies, but let me also read the full diplomatic language to you because that's being repeated now in subsequent statements, including the latest statement by the MEA, which is a summary. In fact, the Chinese ambassador to India, Xu Feihong, has put 10 points on a tweet. So please see that also. That's also on your screen. I will read, however, this key para, which is the mantra around which this whole process is revolving. It says, and I quote, the differences on the boundary question should not be allowed to affect the overall development of bilateral relations. This is what the Chinese wanted in 2005 because India said, settle the boundary question. They said, let other things move on meanwhile. That's how this tug of war went on. So this clause said, the differences on the boundary question should not be allowed to affect the overall development of bilateral relations. The two sides will resolve the boundary question through peaceful and friendly consultations. Neither side shall use or threaten to use force against the other by any means. The final solution of the boundary question will significantly promote good neighborly and friendly relations between India and China. That is so far so good. Then Article 3 says, again, it's in a complicated structure. When these diplomatic documents are written or treaties are written, don't look for healthy syntax, right? Don't look for smooth syntax. It says, both sides should, in the spirit of mutual respect and mutual understanding, make meaningful and mutually acceptable adjustments. Important. This is not like, I will not give 1 inch of land or so and so will not offer you 1 inch of land in exchange. It doesn't say that. Both sides should, in the spirit of mutual respect and mutual understanding, make meaningful and mutually acceptable adjustments to their respective positions on the boundary question so as to arrive at a package settlement. So why did I say a grand bargain? A package settlement to the boundary question. The boundary settlement must be final, covering all sectors on the India-China boundary, and then it goes on to say the two sides will give due consideration to each other's strategic and reasonable interests and the principle of mutual and equal security. And Article 5, the two sides shall take into account inter alia historical evidence, national sentiments, practical difficulties, and reasonable concerns and sensitivities of both sides and the actual state of border areas. That means possession is ownership, right? A little bit like that. I'm again translating it. Article 6 and 7, I told you, that is geographical features and also due respect for settled populations. The latest statement now harks back to this 2005 agreement, which the Chinese had sort of resiled on since 2010. The SR meeting in December in China had also talked about this from the Chinese side. The Indian side had not put this in their readout of those talks because accepting 2005 also means that agreeing to move on with the larger relationship, business, economy, technology, multilateral cooperation, etc., regional grouping cooperation, SCO, for example, BRICS, while at the same time letting the border process go on, border negotiation process go on. Now, India has also mentioned this in our readout, which is a very important thing. One, of course, the Indian readout says the two sides had a candid and in-depth exchange. I told you yesterday that in diplomatic writing, when you say honest and frank exchanges, it means differences, that both sides did not agree on many things. In this case, the word candid means the same thing. Candid and in-depth means the same thing. So, akalmand ko ishara kafi hai. Point 1 on the Indian statement is pretty much point 1 in the 2005 statement. Then it says, and that is the operative part, both sides decided to set up an expert group under the Working Mechanism for Consultation and Coordination, WMCC, on India-China border affairs that is headed by a joint secretary from the Indian side, an equal level officer from the other side, but also has importantly military officers from both sides to explore early harvest in border delimitation in India-China border areas. Now, early harvest is something that is featured now. I hope this is less jinxed than how this term has been used in the India-US bilateral free trade agreement, because there everybody talked of an early harvest before a big trade deal is done by October, by the fall. So I hope it doesn't meet that fate. We try to check out to see what early harvest means. Probably it means looking at some sectors of the LAC where differences or claims are non-existent or mostly non-existent, or a matter of just a little bit of line on the map here and there. And there the line of actual control can be more firmly defined so that clashes cannot take place based on contrary perceptions. This is my land, the other side also thinks this is my land. Two patrols come face to face. Sometimes they just show banners to each other and say go back. And sometimes, as we saw in 2020, they get into fisticuffs or fighting with pipes and sticks and stuff like that. It is to avoid that. From what I understand, this may mean starting the process with Sikkim, which is where boundary dispute is almost non-existent. So at least in one area, you can start drawing your boundary. So early harvest is a new addition this time. Then the other thing it talks about, that's the point 4 from the Indian side, creation of general level mechanisms in eastern and middle sectors in addition to the existing general level mechanism in the western sector. Western sector is Ladakh. So we've known that since this trouble started in Ladakh, our corps commander there and his equivalent from the Chinese side, they've been holding meetings. One meeting on the Indian side, in a hut on the Indian side, one meeting in a hut on the Chinese side. On the Indian side, the hut is at Chushul. On the Chinese side, the hut is in Moldo. And these meetings have been taking place. Now, this statement says that a similar general mechanism is going to be set up for eastern and middle sectors. Eastern means Arunachal Pradesh, maybe including Sikkim also. Middle sector is Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh. So this is progress that the military leaders from the two sides should also have a structured communication system. It also says that there should be an early meeting of the general level, that is Corps Commanders, general level mechanism in the Western sector. Then point 5 is very important because it brings in a word that's been missing in the India-China readouts for the past 5 years. That says use the border management mechanisms at diplomatic and military levels to carry forward the process of border management, simple enough, and discuss de-escalation. That's the word which has now made an appearance. And discuss de-escalation beginning with the principles and modalities thereof. That is the key thing. So if you see the highlights this time, some of it will look repetitive. That's how diplomacy is. But then you pick out the nuggets. The nuggets right now is one, emphasis on an early harvest, and second, the beginning of the process of de-escalation. There are some other things which you will read about. Both countries have decided to resume flights, to give more visas. But important thing also is that the two sides have also renewed their cooperation on exchanging river data, because some of our rivers come into India from Tibet on the Chinese side. Satluj, for example, and Brahmaputra. In the past, China had started giving us hydrological data, then they stopped. In fact, on August 1, 2000, there was a big glacial flood in the Satluj River in the higher reaches in Kinnaur district, which killed 200 people. A 50-foot wall of water came in from the other side. On that, India had not been warned. That was a proper glacial lake outburst flood, or GLOF. There was one more, a smaller one, in August 2023 as well. And India has been missing this data. Now it looks like, if you take this statement seriously or this agreement seriously, the sharing of this river water data will also begin. That is also a positive step going forward. Now, you might ask me the larger question, that just till the other day we were talking about two-front war, what is going on, China is an adversary, India is a member of Quad. Quad is an instrument that the Americans have created with their allies and friends to balance China. How come India and China are warming up to each other so much now? How has this situation changed? So what can I do to explain this? I can do no better than quote to you John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist. And he said his immortal line. It's quoted all the time. His immortal line, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? That is the kind of situation that today has arisen in India-China relations.